Thank you very much. I'm very happy and honored to be part of this secret commune of intellectuals and thinkers here in Saaleck. I have a history with this space because 7 years ago, Arne took me here and it was a total... okay, yeah. Can you hear me? Standing straight? Okay, thank you. That's a big relief now. So I went here with Arne 7 years ago and it was a total ruin. So there was debris here in this room and Arne was so confident that he would turn that into a functioning place, and I had doubts. When I saw this, I thought this will be very hard. And apparently it was very hard, but you turned it into a beautiful space and a very interesting, and maybe one of the most interesting spaces for intellectual discourse and debate about architecture, collective history. So congratulations, I'm very happy to see it totally changed after 7 years after being here. So. Thanks for having me here, and a big applause to Arne, who has done amazing work. So I was very happy that, Arne, you invited me to talk about monuments, because I think it's a timely topic, because in at least European and Northern American cities we witness an unprecedented production of new monuments, sometimes with a very questionable ideological framework behind it. And of course, it's very interesting to see how we as architects and educators and activists could deal with that new production of monuments and the overarching narrative behind them. I want to start not with the monuments itself, but with a look at the situation these monuments are built into, because they're mostly built in cities, and these cities are as we all know, in a crisis that has to do with digitalization, with automatization. We have a situation which is, you architects know it, others are slowly getting there, like politicians understand that we witnessed the biggest change in the character of cities since antiquity, and the biggest production of ruins since antiquity. We have shopping malls that start to look like this. Also in Germany, in the center of Berlin, we have almost half of all the shopping malls standing empty now or being in crisis. We have in Frankfurt, who always was the financial capital of Germany, we have 1 million square meters of empty office spaces. So everything that defined the city for the good or the bad in the history of the city, which is production, exchange of information, production of information, the market, is collapsing in at disturbing speed. So we have to ask ourselves if basically the ruins of Rome are the next model for how to deal with these spaces that modern capitalism has left us with. But instead of thinking of what we could do with all these empty office spaces and empty shopping spaces, and instead of a broader political discourse on the question, what is a city? If it's not a place where we go to work, it's not a place where we go to do shopping, it's not a place where we exchange information, because this, of course, still happens, but it happens in a very different way. But instead of asking these questions of how we could reuse also these spaces in times of climate crisis, we see something completely different, which is this. This is a plan for the center of Berlin. Everything that looks old is new, planned to build. So the only historic object that you see in this image is the futuristic TV tower at Alexanderplatz. The rest is a plan for so-called Molkenmarkt to rebuild the historic setup of the city like it was before modernity hit. And this is a tendency in Germany to almost in every city, you find efforts, either as a plan or here realized in Frankfurt, to rebuild the old city. And of course, this comes with a whole set of normative decisions about what is the city, how do you use the city, who has access to the city, because this was a former popular area of Frankfurt with a lot of cheap shops, butchers, bakeries. It was a very popular, poor area of the city. It has been rebuilt as a historic coulisse, a backdrop to expensive shopping, apparently dedicated to tourists. So you can say that these inner cities turn into spaces that are only used by and designed for tourists and wealthy people, and for a certain idea of memory of what a city is and what a city was. Again, here I showed you the image of the TV tower lurking over the newly old city. This, by the way, is called Neue Altstadt, New Old Town, which also shows you a bit of the bizarreness. And also in the New Old Town, this is the oldest building. It's the Kunstverein that heroically resisted a redesign as an old building. So you find this strange time walk in German cities where everything that looks old has been built during the past 10 years, and everything that looks modern is the oldest structure. It's almost like in the city of Brazilian city of Brasilia, where the historic center is modernist work of art by Oscar Niemeyer and others, and is surrounded by like fake 19th century mansions where the politicians are living. So same in Germany. So we find a situation where modernism has been pushed away from the city. Same here in Berlin. The Palast der Republik, for those who are not familiar with the German history so much, it was built in the 70s by the East German government as an expression of a modern idea of societal living and collective living as a society in the city. It was the seat of the government, but it was also, that's why I call it Palast der Republik. It's also a palace for the people, where people would go to parties and dance and go to lectures, of course, all under the communist narrative. But it was a space where basically the ambition of the state was expressed how society could work, and of course it was a counter building to the Wilhelmian dome that was erected in the Kaiserreich when Germany was still run by an emperor. And as all the Germans here know, there was a big debate of what to do when the wall came down with that building. It was stripped in a technical way, but also stripped in an ideological way. So all the communist symbols were taken away, and that became a big stage where people could experiment, do theater, do art exhibitions, or just hang out and be together. But instead of seeing this as a chance, it was seen as a void, as a wound. So there was a whole rhetoric of damage to the body of the city. And some conservative activists finally convinced politicians that this is an unacceptable void in the city and has to be replaced by the building that was there before the Palast der Republik was built, and of course the famous Berliner Schloss. So again, you find this reconstruction of an old building with all the normative decisions behind it, even with a cross and an inscription on the dome that says, "See the face of Christ and bend your knee," which of course is very insultive to every non-Christian Berliner or visitor. So this Schloss was rebuilt in the center of Berlin. And of course we don't have an emperor anymore, so there was no use for it anymore. And because the activists who wanted to have this building back said, okay, we can't just spend $500 million on building something that is just an empty core, so we have to have a content for it. And the content that looked very tempting for the propagandists of this building was the transformation of the ethnological collection from Dahlem, on the outskirts of Berlin, to the center of the city, into that building. It was maybe the last moment where ethnological collections were not questioned, when the decision was made to put them all in. And finally, as the building opened, we had the discussion of who brought them there and who brought all these objects from Africa, from Asia to this German collection. It turned out, it was colonial researchers who stole these things and even, as we now know, killed people who were the owners of these objects to get a hold of the object. So it's an absolutely contested, difficult, colonial, racist, violent history that is represented in this building. And the opening speech was, "This is an expression of Germany's interest in the world." And of course, it was meant in the sense of we are curious, we also developed, our philosophers decided what enlightenment is, so we brought enlightenment to the world, and now we had all these objects that show our interest in the world, and then if you look into the objects, it's a very belligerent interest in the world. So basically, you normally would have to admit that this is an unacceptable object with an unacceptable acceptable content, but instead they're desperately trying to turn that into an expression of a less belligerent interest in the world. But it's basically, it's a capital disaster. It's a monument that in a very also almost beautiful way shows everything which is problematic about Germany and its history. Well, it was not intended to be that basically expression of a shameful history. It's interesting that wherever we look in Germany, we find a modern building that has been recently replaced by an old-looking building. Same in Potsdam. So this was one of the first data centers built in the world. It was a data center built by a communist East Germany. At the time, of course, and we don't have to romanticize it because it was also dedicated to collect data about people in a very problematic way, but it was also an expression of a belief that the state could use data to do good for the people instead of what we witness now, collecting data to manipulate people to predict their behavior. So it was one of the last moments when data was considered something that the state should use to the benefit of the people. And of course, you can engage in a very long discussion of how this communist state used that data in the end, but it was the moment of, now we have a communist interaction. No. Okay, so there was an interesting depiction of the future as imagined by the government through the use of data, how data could be used to the benefit of the people, funnily enough in a very antique way of a mosaic. It's almost like a Roman mosaic showing the future of the country. On the wall, you see, that was done before they went to the moon, but it said, like almost, we always knew since antiquity that communists will go to the moon soon, thanks to data collection. And so it was a monument of optimism of a state, and now it's about to be taken down and replaced by the building that was standing there before the war, which was the Potsdamer Garnisonskirche. Well, that is a building that was erected by Prussian kings, like many of these buildings, and it has a very special history because it was the building where Hitler finally was handed over power in 1933. That is why Nazis always talked about the Tag of Potsdam, the Day of Potsdam, as the final victory of Adolf Hitler. That took place in this building. So nostalgic people who love Prussia and right-wing people who love this very special history of Germany love that church. That is the famous commemoration of the act of handing over power to Hitler. It was Hindenburg who was the president then, who could have refused to hand over power to Hitler, but he did. So finally, this is a very dark moment in German history, and the way they reconstruct the church now is, of course, completely devoid of every critical reflection of what it means if a country is rebuilding that church instead of the modernist building without addressing in a very critical way what also happened in this building. Meanwhile, also in Potsdam, the modern building is replaced by an old-looking building. There is a desire to commemorate the reunification of Germany with a monument. And this is maybe the silliest monument that has ever been voted for by a government, and it is under construction now. There were some bats in the foundation that hampered the finishing of the monument, but now it will be open very soon, next year. And so just to explain you, this is already the castle, the Schloss, with a collection of Germany's interest in the world inside. And as if that wasn't bad enough, they added a symbol of reunification. And so there was a discourse on what is a monument before. And rightly so, people criticized that monuments are static objects that commemorate a certain moment, but you can only stare at them and do nothing. And these guys here who designed, it's a design office from Stuttgart, not artists, they do PR and design, and they said, a monument should be something where people are activated. Activation of people always sounds great. Huh? You can do something and you're not a visitor, but you are becoming an actor. So they kind of vampirized this idea of the vocabulary of empowerment to implement an object that has only one sense. It is bending to one side or to the other side, depending on how many people walk into one direction. And this should express, following the argument of the designers, the fact that if you gather together in a group, you can change something. That's the idea. So you walk into one direction, you feel, I'm moving a big thing. And that should be empowering, and it should be activating you as a citizen. You could also read it more critically, because I say it's an expression of every time when too many people in Germany march into one direction, things go down. But it's an almost painful, visceral depiction of the rejection of individuality. So if you're one person and standing on the left side here, and you don't want to march into that direction to make things move and make things possible, and make things go down, you're standing here, you're lifted up as in a shameful movement. You're exposed here. You're the one who's not like the others. You're the one who insists on being an individual, a different person with a different idea of life. So you're almost forced into this like downfall here. And so this is basically the most prominent monument in the most prominent place of Germany, where Germany wants to represent its history, its recent history. And I think that is, of course, a very complicated idea and almost inexplicable how this made it through all the political instances and is next year introduced as an image of how Germany works. It's also interesting because we see all these objects popping up in cities. This is clearly one with a political meaning, remembering a certain moment of time. But there's also another production of monuments that I want to draw your attention to, which is leisure monuments. So apparently, cities are either designed for touristic use or for entertainment. And you see this reflected in all these giant constructions that are built in cities to entertain certain people in certain ways. This is the High Line in New York, which not only has this giant shed, it's called, it's an object that can move, and also the whole narrative of the city should be flexible and change its appearance, blah, blah, blah. To move this thing is costing over $15,000 to make it move, so it's an enormous structure, and that is accompanied, as you can see here, by this so-called honeycomb by Thomas Heatherwick. This is just a giant sculptural staircase that serves two purposes. You should walk up, and it was hailed as an object that brings people together, but brings people together through sport. You can practice. If you run up there, you're very fit if you come up at the top. So it's basically a public gym with a platform where you can look at the skyline of Manhattan. So there are two functions that you're proposed to exert in public space. One is running and one is contemplating. That's basically the two functions that are encouraged by it. And I think this drawing by Thomas Heatherwick's studio is very telling, because if you look at what is called the public space here, it's very interesting. You could not march in a protest march here. You can just walk one by one, undulating through, and then walk up here and contemplate. So nature and what was dubbed by the Bloomberg government in New York, when Bloomberg was mayor of New York, he had redesigned many public spaces like this. So they were basically empty spaces, what the Italians call the piazza aperta, an open space, and they were covered with city furniture. And while I really loved Rodrigo's show, I'm sorry that I'm so slow with my images, it's old school, yeah? But I really loved the work, because this work, and I know some of them, is really activating people in a serious way. This is though it might seem similar, just putting objects in a space, it's doing the opposite of what you do, because it's basically blocking forms of interaction, and it's blocking forms of expression of indignation, anger. And it was interesting to see when I was in New York when Trump was elected for the first and hopefully last time, and people wanted to march in protest, and it was interesting, you could not march in Manhattan. It's impossible. You can't march on the streets, and you rarely find a space where you could gather and walk and hold up things, because everything had been redesigned in this way by Bloomberg, that you could just march one after the other and sit on a bench and contemplate whatever you want to contemplate, but you could not be an active political citizen because the space was blocked with city furniture like this. And we find this in many spaces. This is the Accor Metall Tower in London, which is basically taking the same principle. You can walk up and you can look down, and that's all you can do, and otherwise it's an expression of wealth, of an international capital. This is Metall is one of the 100 richest people in the world who paid this as an expression of London's festive identity, but actually also it's just a symbol of power in public space that represents a certain expectation towards people how they should be acting in public space, which is exactly this: just walk and look and shut up. Huh? And even in small space, I mean, this is an argument. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of this object there. It's less aggressive, but also here you can see city furniture is also occupying the city with a certain expectation of what you can do there. You could sit there, you can sip a coffee, you can maybe have nice conversations, and it's totally okay. I love cafes, but if everything looks like this, certain practices that have been part of the freedom of the city, of the freedom of the citizens of the city, are not possible anymore, like doing a demonstration in these spaces. Zuccotti Park, yeah, redesigned. It was called Liberty Place before. Has been redesigned by a company and got the name of the CEO. So Zuccotti was the guy who paid for it. And of course, they put tons of objects, which is also kind of a defense line. We try to run away from the police here. Try to march. Try to hold up a banner. Yeah, the banner's in the trees. You run into a box, you're arrested in a second. So that's a kind of a generic space in Italy, but you could do everything here, yeah, and you can almost do nothing here. Yeah? But it's called city improvement. So Tahrir Square, Egypt, yeah. In the time of the Pros, it was an empty space. You could just many people could go here. Now it's occupied with a monument that represents the glory of Egypt's history. Yeah? It's an ancient obelisk, and then you have all these steps here. So it's very hard to use this space again in this way. So we find all these objects that are put into the city, dubbed as city improvement, yeah, but that actually hamper certain uses of the space. So as architects and educators who think about public space, we asked ourselves, in my teaching practice with students from Harvard and from Frankfurt, where I'm also teaching, we said, what can we do in this situation? And we looked into collective practices in Germany in the past like 40 years, and of course this was one of the most beautiful collective activisms, was to take down the wall individually. So when you came to Berlin in 1990, you could buy for cheap money a little hammer. Yeah? And they would go to the Berlin Wall and hammer out a piece. So this collective monster, the wall, became, was basically put into millions of parts that vanished in the pockets of visitors to Berlin, and everybody turned this wall into part of his individual history of himself or herself being in Berlin at that historic moment. So the wall is dispersed all over the world, and everybody in Tokyo and Tel Aviv and India has maybe a piece of the wall, and also it deteriorated in a beautiful way because the structure held, but it was of course getting strange windows. Very beautiful. So my students had the very funny idea to say, what if we, disguised as tourists, would go to the Schloss, yeah? Pretending to be interested in the beautiful details of the facade and just hammering out pieces and taking it home and turning the castle that has been invented by this guy, which is a tractor dealer from North Germany, who said, unfortunately, modernism has taken over and he wants the Schloss back, and he single-handedly pushed it through that it was built. So a political genius, but of course a very complicated figure. He recently gave an interview saying, being asked about the quagmire of the collections, he said, yeah, ethnological museum in the building was not ideal, but it's the maximum we can get in a society, democratic society like this. We could ask, okay, what society do you want then instead? So my students said it would be nice to basically dismantle the building the same way the Berlin Wall was dismantled. At the same time, and I want to basically end on that note already, in the city I'm teaching in, Frankfurt, we still, though they have this crisis of building and they have 1 million square meters of empty office space, there's still buildings erected in two forms of buildings. One is still towers, where international companies represent their power through towers. And then you have an equivalent of expression of power, not with high-rise buildings, but with large-scale mat schemes, which is server farms. So an interesting portion of Frankfurt is eaten up by server farms. Because the demand of storage space for data and of data is so big, and now with artificial intelligence and large language scale models, we need more and more space for these server farms. So we have basically whole areas of Frankfurt where people could experiment and try out things are eaten up by either towers or server farms. This also is true for the university I'm teaching at, Städelschule, and also the Senckenberg Gesellschaft, which is our cooperation partner for biodiversity research. Here, located in a beautiful 1950s building by Ferdinand Kramer, are under siege because companies want to get the university out, and the city is tempted to sell the whole university campus to private developers who are building these like mixed-use office and luxury housing towers. This campus doesn't look great, but is the campus where the Frankfurt School, the important critical school of Adorno and Horkheimer, was located. So Horkheimer was teaching in this building. So the whole like critical post-war theory had its seat here. So it is almost a drama that that this historic space where the Frankfurt critical theory is developed is about to vanish from the city, and it will be replaced by mixed-use office towers. So we said, what can we do as a university, as citizens and activists to counteract this? Because also we have to acknowledge that this architecture is coming here is pushing away space where those who come to Germany from different countries under precarious conditions are housed. This is a refugee campus outside Frankfurt, and it shows basically the degree 0 of architecture, where people are brought to containers and then fenced, because there are security requirements that you cannot sleep on the ground floor if there's not a big fence. So those people who come from Syria, from other countries to Germany are basically brought to these containers and then fenced. And we said this is, of course, an unacceptable condition, and we had a team of students who worked on alternatives to stay in the same price range as these containers, but to come up with a different proposal. And that was one of the first models. Just to quickly explain it, this should be a market hall, and then they said we put housing on top. Of course, that would be expensive to build, but it's an image that shows you what the idea and the expectation is, to say, why don't we put these architectures into the city, for example, onto the campus, and invite people who come to Germany to use this as their space. It can be workshops. We talked to people from people from Syria who said we want to open a mobile phone repair shop. Other people said we want to do a bakery. We want to do this and that. And the idea was to say, can we reverse the narrative of the seeking guest and the generous German who says, we give you this beautiful container village with a fence and you can basically be sheltered here, and said, can we maybe offer something else where the German is a seeking guest who has a problem, phone doesn't work, hungry, whatever, and the person who's here is part of a solution. Because also we thought it is one of the problems that we also have to encounter in Germany now is we don't have positive imagery of the effect of those people who came here since 2015 to Germany. There's no positive imagery. If we have imagery in newspapers, it shows a Syrian refugee and a German carpenter, and the German carpenter is holding a hammer and the Syrian looks at him as if he had to learn how to use a hammer. But the reality is that the quality of food, for example, in Berlin has remarkably improved thanks to the influx of many cooks from non-German countries. But this is not represented in any image. Huh? There you go to a German bistro and you think, this is great. What did you do? Did you go to a cooking class? And they say, they have somebody who really knows how to cook. But there's no image for it. So we said, can we create a positive image of what happened in the past years instead of having all these gloomy tales of Germany being under siege by refugees? And we said we should create a space of exchange where people could actually also enter in a direct contact with anyone who comes, and that can be students or refugees or anyone who is less affluent in this moment. So we designed something. We thought the market hall is a nice model because people like markets, and it's not a big space, but everybody likes it. So German loves markets. And what if we build a market with housing on top? And that went through different iterations and problems, and I tell you, it's incredibly almost impossible to build something in a city when you say that there will be refugees living together with students. Then people say, but we can't insure it. There's no insurance who will do it with you. So it took us 2 years to get insurance for the project. Funding was much quicker, and these were conceptual sketches. And then we fundraised money, and we said, at the moment where the campus shall be sold to private developers, we want to put an object that makes it impossible to secretly kill the campus. So we had this built, prefabricated very cheaply from, most of the wood you see here is wood that we took from formwork of concrete bridge construction. So it's also a study in how can you build cheaply and with less CO2 footprint a house that is a dignified space for anyone who comes to Germany. It's under construction in Frankfurt now at the courtyard of Senckenberg, and we're very happy to open it for sure on the 1st of October, and then students and activists and Syrian activists and other refugees will be working on that and making it their own space in the coming months and hopefully the next year. So this is as you see, under construction. The steel also that is used here is reused steel, so it's really a building built from material that is normally thrown away. And it's our little contribution to occupy a space that would have been otherwise redesigned with a beautiful decorative leisure monument in the middle and surrounded by hotels. So that a little small scale but scalable. You could build like hundreds of accommodations like that, and it's not more. It's maybe 10% more expensive than container villages to build like this. So that's our little reaction to the monumental disaster. This will also be, and I'm going to end on this note. It will be also an educational space because we want to carry this discourse on what is architecture, what is a city, who has right to the city, what do we do in the city. We want to also take that to the schools, so there will be a school program for young people because you know, maybe you don't know it, that in Germany from early age on the toy industry creates a very simplest idea of what architecture is and what people do in architecture. So women are almost on the balcony always. No right to go to the garden. The garden is used by a man to do barbecue. This is Germany in 2024, and the city is also. What is? If you ask, what is city life? Huh? City life looks like this. Huh? City life can turn into city action, where young people with skateboards are, of course, arrested, and if they're good enough, they can escape. So we also want to question this narrative about architecture in the city with a slightly more inclusive and playful alternative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Niklas. Brilliant presentation. I'm going to open it up straight away for a couple of questions so that we're not super late for lunch, which is coming up soon.
You think that the reconstruction of traditional architecture in a liberalism, as it exists in Germany, Hungary, Russia, the United States, is an inevitable bond? Or is there some sort of redemption for these reconstructed objects?
No, I mean, I'm not even against reconstruction, but the question is, how do you reconstruct it? And I think the Frankfurt example is a very telling one. Now I do the Rodrigo thing, look. But I'm not as fast, I'm sorry. But the Frankfurt thing is interesting because it would have been great to reconstruct the lively character of this formerly popular area of the city that was open to everybody, that had small shops and was basically a very inclusive, chaotic space. But I think the problem is not, I mean, also I think it looks very ugly, but I think you could discuss that, right? But I think the thing here is, what is the problem is that this zone is basically dead, and you can only buy Gucci handbags and souvenirs. Yeah? And that's the problem about reconstruction, that the reconstruction in that narrative is always reconstruction and expulsion of people. Huh? So it's always, that's why I called it an eliminatory practice. This space, I mean, look at the people in the animation. It's even here, they don't even try to make it look diverse. Huh? It's just middle-class Germans, yeah, who hang out here, and that's the main problem. So there's nobody, you know? As you can see. This is it looks like a 3D animation where people were too lazy to put people, but it looks like this. And so I think that is the problem with reconstruction. Why not reconstruct some beautiful things that have been destroyed? But I think the use of this space when the reconstruction is pushed through is a problem. That has to do with also the financial aspect of it, because this is very expensive to build, of course, and then you have to make money to refinance it. So you need rich people, and you have to expel all the less affluent people. And that's the structural core problem of reconstruction. Besides the question of narratives, that you rebuild Hitler's favorite church without even putting an informational plate in front of it to say this was also a dark space. Huh? No, and I think that's the main problem. There were more questions, I think.
Does anyone else?
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay, 1 second.
Niklas, thank you so much for your presentation, which really sort of triggers all the critical thoughts I also have about the reconstructive trends in German architecture. How do you explain the structures where these things can actually happen? I mean, the Stadtschloss, the reconstruction of the Prussian, this symbol sort of the Prussian Empire in the center of Berlin. I stand every time I'm there, I look at it and I just don't understand how it actually happened. And now just to add to that, now just across from the palace, if I'm correctly informed, there used to be the German Building Academy, which was a building by Schinkel, who was a beautiful architect in the early 1900s, but has long gone. And now, in the phase of the history we're in now, we are reconstructing Schinkel's Building Academy as Schinkel's Building Academy. There is no rammed earth, there's nothing new, nothing conceptual, nothing vibrant. It's a reconstruction again. How is it possible?
I think in the case of the Schloss, it's very easy to explain. It was the initiative of a tractor seller who went bankrupt and had a lot of time to become an activist to reconstruct his vision of Prussia. And there was a pressure group of people who very intelligently addressed people who hated GDR and hated communism and said, this is still the dominance of communism in Berlin is unacceptable. We should go back to a moment when it was more beautiful. Then we had a chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, who also thought modernism is ugly, a castle looks better. And it was on that level was the discussion, and then it was pushed through with a narrative of, a very dangerous narrative that also returns now in the political debate about Germany, that the collective body of Germany or the collective body of the city has been wounded by modernism, and that the wound is still there, and basically every space that was empty, like this one, was declared a wound. So it was basically this is the wound, and it has to be sealed, so the body has to be covered with new skin. The skin is, of course, old skin, very old skin. But that rhetoric really made it, and everybody said Berlin can't be healed if the Schloss is not coming back. That was the argument, and that was taken on by many politicians. Instead of saying this is a great experimental space, and you could basically also leave some space to future generations to use it and appropriate it. But of course, that was a generation of then 60-year-old, now 80-year-old politicians who were so much educated in a confrontative manner to say communism has to be defeated and we have to win, we have to express how we won. So it was basically this narrative of the end of history and the victory of Western values and Western capitalism that should be represented in the urbanistic fabric that basically forced this building down and had it be rebuilt for $500 million as a castle with a we talked about it. I mean, with everything bad inside. So I think that was also a generational problem of politicians who have been educated in this Cold War narrative.
Thank you for your presentation, and I really love the way you put all these monuments and the bezel and everything. So I think we should explode them. Like, we have to do something to stop doing that. So I raised the question of how, how as we here can start, like, because I love that you show it, but then how can we do something against those monuments to not being built? Well, it's a time where...
Yeah. One proposal by my students was to dismantle it with hammers, which is, of course, a funny proposal, but also I think, and that would be something also Arne here for Saaleck, I think would be very interesting. How can you occupy a monument that is designed not to be occupied, but it's just a giant staircase, or it's just an object that could be adorned? And I think that would be interesting for architects to say, how can we really occupy it, and how can we bring people that are expelled through the object, and banned from certain areas. How can we bring these people back? I think it's mostly about bringing people back to the city. That's why we have this like humble little idea of the elevated boxes to say we want to bring those people who are pushed out of Frankfurt by this form of aggressive new town planning that expels less affluent people. How can we bring these people back, and in what structures can we bring them back, and how can they be housed, and how can they become again part of a society that happens in the inner cities that is redesigned for tourists and wealthy people. So I think that's more about the question how to bring back people, and I think you can basically ask Rodrigo to bring furniture, and with the furniture people, or you can say we destroy a monument in the way that it becomes inhabitable. Or if New York would have a slightly more experimental mayor, we say we take this giant structure of the honeycomb and turn that into affordable housing with small shops, and we turn that into kind of a giant a real honeycomb with bees this time, and not only a symbolic one. So I think that's all about reoccupation of the city with people. And I think there, of course, you are architects, you know 10,000 strategies, but I think it has to be pushed through politically to say, we want to bring these people that have been expelled by town planning and by these monumental disasters out of the city to really bring them back.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to ask one quick question before we then head to lunch, which is outside, where we came in, by the gatehouse. As a designer myself, I really appreciate the critique that you've taken us through about contemporary or recent contemporary German history and the story of public space. Everyone knows about the death vehicle known as the vessel. But as designers who operate, I'm not a student, I'm not even emerging anymore, I operate in an economy. I try to get jobs. I have an office to run, and a lot of these things, or all of these things that you talk about, are driven by the neoliberal economy and its political frameworks in the municipal authorities. Particularly, I'm thinking about London, where I'm from. And as a designer, you can quite quickly get to the point where you see all of these you understand all of this criticism and you see it very viscerally, but you don't have agency over it as a designer. So I guess I'm just wondering, how do you think design might be able to offer alternatives in this situation?
Yeah, and I'm really very optimistic in that point, because I think we all as educators and designers have this slightly depressive idea about neoliberalism running the whole economy worldwide, and we have no agency and no power to question it. But I think we are, at least in continental Europe, and I know you left Europe, unfortunately, but politicians in Europe start to understand that if we don't develop our own economy in Europe, we will be dependent on China and America. This means that the European Union spends a lot of money in developing like economic frameworks, yeah, and that is a whole infrastructure containing server farms, new campuses, kind of European Silicon Valleys, but this time for the benefit of the people. So there is a lot of economic potential to develop a different economy that is not, for example, extracting data to manipulate you and make the prices for your next train ride higher, but really to use data to the common good. And in Barcelona, there have been attempts to create these algorithms through the state and to create a digital economy that is more in alignment with an idea of data for the common good. And like some visionary people like Francesca Bria have tried out to turn that into an economic model. And this economic model requires a lot of designers to design spaces for that new European digital economy. Yeah, because digital economy is not only computers, it's also server farms. It's spaces that will be added to server farms. These server farms can be imagined like a reef where you can dock on, you can build things on top, you can use the warmth that comes out, but you can also turn that into an educational space. And I think there is a lot of potential for designers to design a framework that is designed by politicians to counteract a Silicon Valley or authoritarian Chinese idea of a digital society. So I think in this moment, designers are crucial to design the infrastructure, create the infrastructure, and design spaces around that digital economy. So I would be absolutely not depressive about it.
That was a really nice note to end on. Thank you so much, Niklas.